So I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's webinar and thank you for coming. Sorry about having to reschedule and any potential confusion with dates, but appreciate your understanding in this crazy busy time of year for us. Before introducing tonight's topic, I just wanted to mention a few upcoming events here with the Great Basin Bird Observatory. On August 8th through 10th, I will be in Great Basin National Park with a nonprofit called Soldiers to Scientists. This is a group of veterans that travel around the country to participate in community science. This year, they have a 2-week trip to Great Basin National Park with 3 days dedicated to Pinyon Jay surveys. So anyone that's interested can join us out there. And there's opportunity to join for surveys, do your own surveys, partner with veterans and survey with them. But I'll be doing a little bit of training with them on the protocol, talking about some cone counting because there ought to be cones out at that time of year. Um, and yeah, there'll be a lot of opportunity for just hanging out, talking about Pinyon Jays, and spending time in Great Basin National Park. So that is open to everyone, and we'll have some more info about that soon on the web. But we also have some award celebrations for our annual Nevada Birdathon coming up on July 19th in Reno at the Pigeon Head Brewery and on August 5th in Las Vegas. So we got more info about those on the events calendar on our website. And so without further ado, I'm pretty excited about tonight's presentation. My coworker here at GBBO, Kelly Colegrove, is going to be talking a bit about the ecology of the pinyon pine and cone production, but really focusing on the relationship of the pinyon jay to this plant. So we have recently developed a protocol for community science and an accompanying Survey 123 form where volunteers can help us track the productivity of pinyon pines. Later this month, or next month, Kelly will talk about some of that variability in production. Pinyon cones will begin ripening, and we hope folks will help us count some of these cones. So I'm going to mute myself and let Kelly Colegrove take it away.
All right, thanks, Ned. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me. I gave a similar talk about this last year when we first rolled out this protocol. So for some people, this is probably going to be more of a review. For other people, I hope you learned something new. But I will just get right into it. I'm joining you from Tonopah, so I apologize if my internet gets a little shaky here and there. Throughout this presentation, I'm going to talk a little bit about the pinyon jays and their relationship with pinyon pines and pinyon juniper woodlands. We talk a lot about pinyon jays and their dependency on pinyon juniper woodlands, but I'm going to go into a lot more detail than we usually do talking about that. And then I'm going to take a little break and talk more about cone production and get more into information about the plant. And finally, I'll talk about how everyone can get involved with this data collection that we're talking about. Pinyon jays and pinyon juniper woodlands are considered to have a mutualistic relationship. And we say that all the time, but what does that mean? It means that both pinyon jays and pinyon juniper woodlands, specifically pinyon pines, benefit from that relationship. And there are a lot of things that indicate really how those two species have co-evolved over time and how dependent they are on each other. Specifically, pinyon jays, they use pinyon juniper woodlands as a food resource. They eat pinyon pine nuts. They use it as a nesting substrate. And they're very dependent on the structure of pinyon juniper woodlands. Across most of their range, pinyon jays eat pinyon nuts as their primary food source. And pinyon jays are, they're corvids. They are omnivores. They will eat a variety of different things. They have been known to supplement on ponderosa pine nuts and other types of pine nuts, especially when pinyon nuts are not available. They'll eat juniper berries, and they're often seen foraging for insects. They eat a lot of insects, especially during the breeding season when protein needs are a little bit higher. But they've evolved to have this competitive advantage for pinyon pine nuts. For one thing, we talk a lot about how they have that naked bill. That's where they get their nose. The Pinyon jays are the first birds that are able to get into these cones. Even before the cones start opening, pinyon jays have learned ways to smash the cones open so they can start getting those seeds early if they need to. They're the first birds that are able to get into those cones, and those cones are just deep enough. The seeds are just deep enough. The pinyon jays can get into those cones before any other species. They don't have that same competitive advantage when it comes to ponderosa pine seeds, or definitely not with berries or some of the other birds that eat insects and are much more adapted to eating insects than them. So they really have that competitive advantage. There are other things that they've evolved to be better at understanding which seeds are ripe, or which nuts have the most nutrition. Pinyon jays have been seen, they'll weigh the nut in their bill to be able to tell if it's actually developed, which is really impressive if you think about it. I mean, we couldn't tell. I mean, maybe if we were smaller, but they've evolved to even be able to tell the color of the nut. And so they really have this advantage with pinyon pine nuts. There was a study done years ago where they actually removed a bunch of the nuts from a crop, and every single one of them was the dark colored mature seed that can actually supply them with nutrition, and none were the ones that are like empty seeds. So they've really evolved to be impressive in this way. We've also seen a lot of studies where pinyon jay populations don't do well when seeds are not producing. They tend to arrest breeding, especially if it's a year of poor productivity. One year, they won't breed the next year, or maybe breed in very limited quantities, and we don't know how cone production affects their breeding success year after year. So it really shows how much these birds depend on these nuts. They do nest in pinyon juniper woodlands, but we think that they will nest in a lot of different tree species. We've certainly documented them in ponderosa pine nests or ponderosa pine trees, and recently mountain mahogany trees. So they will nest in other things, but pinyon pines seem to be their preferred nesting substrate when the option is available for mature pinyon pines. And also the structure of the woodlands. I'm not going to go into detail about pinyon jay behavior and how they use different parts of their habitat to fill different resource needs, but they do prefer these open woodlands with a lot of heterogeneity that's really a broken down mosaic, and that's how they are able to fulfill all their life cycle needs. And at the same time, there are a lot of things that pinyon pines do that attract pinyon jays to come disperse their seeds. For one thing, the cones tightly hold those seeds in place. There are a lot of pine species and other, seed dispersing techniques that just open up and let the seeds fall out, but these hold them really close. You can see in this photo, there's a little flange that holds that in, and that is not spiky like a lot of other cones. So the pinyon pine is really trying to make these cones accessible to pinyon jays. And by trying, I mean that over time, the cones and the trees that we were better adapted for pinyon jays to forage on them did better overall. And that is because pinyon jays are really top dispersers for pinyon pines. Whoops. Sorry about that. So pinyon jays they can hold a lot more nuts in their crop than a lot of other species. We typically say 40 to 50. I think there have been counts 56 seeds in their crop at any given time. That's significantly more than a lot of other dispersers. Scrub jays, for example, carry about 5 nuts in their crop at a time. So a single pinyon jay flock can cache 4.5 million seeds in a season if it's a large enough flock. So that's pretty significant. They also cache in different areas, so they're not going to the same spot. A lot of flocks have between 5 and 7 different cache sites they use depending on the year. So these pinyon pine trees are getting their seeds dispersed to wide areas. They are not, they don't cluster all their seeds together. They are scatter hoarders. So it's a large area, you know, a couple 100 meters or even a football field, for example, that they're spreading these seeds over. So it's really beneficial for the trees to have pinyon jays dispersing them. So the pinyon pines are providing the sustenance for pinyon jays, and at the same time, the pinyon pines are getting their seeds dispersed over a large area. And it really is this dance between pinyon juniper woodlands and pinyon jays that is really impressive to see, and this mutualistic relationship. It is very intertwined, it's very dynamic. So when we see declines in cone productivity, we see declines in pinyon jay populations and vice versa. And it takes time, but this is how it's supposed to interact. The problem is these declines are not usually as steady going over 50 years as what we're seeing. Seeing, you know, fluctuations every 10 years or so, that wouldn't be that alarming. But when we see a pretty consistent trend, that's when we have to stop and wonder what's going on. And it turns out both pinyon juniper woodlands and pinyon jays are under pressure. We talk a lot about pinyon jay declines in our community science department and across our organization because it is something we are very involved in. And when a species declines, one of the first things we look at is the quantity and quality of their habitat. And for pinyon juniper woodlands, this is a pretty complicated story. Pinyon juniper has been largely understudied in general. Since the 40s, the Forest Service deemed pinyon juniper woodlands as having no commercial value, and therefore there was no money going into researching the management of pinyon juniper woodlands and what we can do. We don't typically get a lot of commercial value out of pinyon juniper woodlands. It's not used for lumber. Pinyon pine harvest is, you know, a small fraction of any sort of income. So there really hasn't been that much money that has gone into it. And overall, I mean, we've removed over 3 million acres of pinyon juniper woodlands for things like grazing. In the past, that's shifting, but we're still removing a lot of pinyon juniper woodlands for things like fire resilience and increasing sagebrush habitat, which is important. All these things need to be considered when we're managing our woodlands for multiple species and multiple uses. The only thing is we're not considering all the species. So now things are changing and people are taking multiple species into account. But up until this point, we are just really lacking a lot of information. And then, of course, throwing in climate change, it adds an extra complication to the story. So there's been a lot of talk about pinyon juniper woodland expansion and how we need to cut back pinyon juniper woodlands because it's encroaching into our other habitats. And there's a lot of infill, but then there's also a lot of pinyon juniper die-off. So there are very conflicting opinions on the status of pinyon juniper woodlands during this time. But overall, we believe there has been a gross simplification of the landscape, meaning what used to be this very heterogeneous mixture of different age classes, different canopy covers, different patches of pinyon juniper woodlands has, based on management, a lot of times become just more homogeneous and the same over time. So that may be impacting pinyon jay populations in general. But then the other side to this puzzle is the cone production side to the puzzle, and that's what we're going to really focus on for the rest of this talk. And really, these two main hypotheses for pinyon jay declines are likely working in tandem. It's not probably going to happen that we find out that one is much more, you know, having an impact on pinyon jay populations and the other is not. And they all kind of work together. Pinyon jays are impacting woodland health. Woodland health is impacting cone productivity. Cone productivity is also impacting woodland health and pinyon jays. So it's really this cycle where everything's working together and in tandem. As many of you guys know, GBBO launched its community science effort in 2021 to gather additional information on Pinyon Jay flock locations. We've had amazing participation with over 4,000 records and nearly 500 volunteers over many states. And this image just shows some of the information that we're gathering using that protocol. It's really a way to get information on where pinyon jays are on the landscape and what they're doing on the landscape, and then what specific features of the landscape do they prefer. So we know they like pinyon juniper woodlands. We know they like sort of the ecotone between pinyon juniper woodlands and shrublands or grasslands, but we don't have a lot of like quantitative information. And I mentioned earlier how there are a lot of different needs that we're managing for and a lot of different species. And without having a lot of like those very specific numbers, it's hard to manage for all of those species because some people are going to say we need to remove pinyon juniper woodlands for sage grouse, and other people are going to say no, we need more pinyon juniper woodlands for other species, and we need our pinyon juniper, we need pinyons to be really old for juniper titmice, and no, we need young pinyon junipers because they tend, the 100-year-old, they tend to be more productive. So it's trying to figure out, like, find the numbers so that we can really hone in that management to benefit all the species, not just pinyon jays, not just sage grouse, not just humans, but really everyone. And so the information that we've been gathering is we are currently analyzing all that data. That's going to take some time, but I think it's going to be really informative. And I can't thank everyone that has participated enough because it's going to be really enlightening to see where we have documented pinyon jays on such a wide landscape. This isn't a study that was done on one mountain range. It's done across the entire Southwest. And so that's really important. One of the things we're doing to analyze this, we can look at pinyon jays based on and compare it to canopy cover, things like, distance from water, all these things that we have spatial layers for. One thing we don't have spatial layers for is productive cone stands. We don't even know exactly what makes a stand productive and what doesn't. So it's really early in the infancy of that knowledge. And so we need to fill in those gaps a little bit. I'm gonna give it a second there just in case anybody has questions about pinyon jays and the pinyon jay relationship with pinyon pine before I talk about cones specifically and pinyon pine productivity. Annette, I don't know if do you see like hands raised?
I can if they were raised, but they're
Okay,
currently not.
cool. Then we will move on.
Cool. And yeah, feel free to type stuff in the chat too, people in the audience for whatever, and we'll get to it when there's a good moment. So, all right.
Okay. So in collecting cone data, which is what we were proposing to do, we're really hoping to gather information on a couple different things. The first thing is what factors are contributing to cone production, and are there ways we can protect this resource knowing that information? We get a lot of calls and there's a lot of talk about how we can, protect productive pinyon pine stands if we think that that's a factor contributing to pinyon pine or pinyon jay declines. And right now we just don't have a good information. We can't expect people to go out and survey an entire project area in the fall before a project is set to be completed to be sure there are no productive pine stands. And on top of that, things change year after year. So it gets really complicated. And then two, which is where we are uniquely situated to get some information on, is how do pinyon jays respond to this cone production on a large scale? say we know there are a lot of productive pine stands in an area, does that mean we have the Pinyon Jay flocks have a smaller home range? Does it mean that their numbers, they have a higher density of jays? Does it mean that they're producing better? You know, a lot of these things we just don't have a feel for. We can conjecture and we have some thoughts and ideas. It sort of makes logical sense that if there's a lot of food resources, Pinyon Jay populations will do better, but we need more information to really back that up as in a substantive way. Pinyon pines start as tiny seeds, as in you can see this picture on the top right. I think it's your right. I can't remember if I have a mirror image, but there's a tiny, tiny pinyon seed with a tiny little plant coming out. To establish, pinyon pines require pretty cool wet conditions, which we don't have all that often. So it doesn't always happen, but they require that. And for a long time, they grow really slowly, especially during the first 10 years of their life. So pinyon pines are often found growing under what we call nursery plants, so under juniper plants, under sagebrush. And by the time we're really seeing them, those plants are about 10 years old. They only grow about an inch a year for the first 10 years or so. So it's really slow going and they need pretty good conditions that entire time. So it takes a while to establish pinyon pines. Out in the wild and even in nurseries, there have been a lot of attempts lately to have nursery plants to reestablish areas after fires or, you know, that have been overgrazed. And it's been very challenging for a lot of people to actually get those plants to cultivate and grow. And like I said, 10 years is a long time for a baby plant to be able to survive. And then after that, it still takes another 15 to 25 years for them to be able to produce cones. So it's a slow going process. And then at about 100 years, give or take, they tend to peak, their cone production peaks, and that lasts for a couple hundred years. Pinyon pines, if you don't know, there are two species that we often talk about. There's Monophila, which is what we have in Nevada, and then Edulis, which we have in the desert Southwest. Both plants tend to behave very similarly. Pinus edulis, the two-needle pinyon in the Southwest, tends to mature a little bit faster, and the cones are slightly smaller. But for general purposes, we consider them to be very similar. Here's some images of pinyon pines aging. So on your left, that's a very young pinyon pine. You can tell you can probably just tell by how high it is, but they start out in this sort of small round conformation. And then in the middle, that's like a mid-aged tree, still less than 100, I would say. And it's still pretty rounded. And I couldn't find a good photo of a very nice mature pinyon pine, but they tend to get very asymmetrical. The lower limbs start dying, the older limbs or the limbs towards the top are growing in all different directions. They are taller, but it's really hard to age these trees. I mean, height isn't necessarily a good way. We can measure the base of the trunk as a way to get an idea of how old the trees are. The best method is certainly coring the trees to be able to count the tree rings to age them, but there's a lot of variability because they grow very dependent on the weather, which in the dry, arid West that we live, conditions are always fluctuating. So we think of pinyon pines as maturing, like I said, around that 30-year time period. But it's really hard to tell when a tree is 30 years old. So what we often use, just like off the cuff, is a 6-foot rule. So if trees are less than 6 feet and they have this round conformation like the tree on the left, they are likely not old enough yet to produce cones. There are always exceptions. You can see this tree all the way on the right. That was a tiny, tiny pinyon pine. It was probably only 3 feet tall, and you can see it produced its one cone last year. So there's quite a bit of variability. It takes once pinyon pines are mature, it takes 2.5 years for cones to actually mature. There are a lot of environmental conditions that impact this, but it's thought that production is initiated in the summer, like June, July, August, and that is when cone production is established. So we need cool, wet conditions in late summer, early fall to establish the beginning of a lot of cones. That doesn't mean that all of those cones are going to make it to maturity. They can abort at any time. High temperatures really impact this. We had, I think it was 2003, we were seeing baby cones everywhere in May and June, and we thought it was going to be a mast year. And then by the time the cones were supposed to be mature, every site that we visited, every cone was aborted. We didn't find a single ripe cone that year. So a very intense heat wave can kill off any of the cones that are supposed to be maturing. Again, 2.5 years, they initiate, they go into a stasis, then we have a spring where they're actually pollinated. They go into another stasis, and it isn't until about March before they are mature that you can even see that cone. So it's in the second year that they're even visible and able to be counted, and it's not until really like June or July that they become mature enough that they're easy to spot. And it is so variable. Again, these weather conditions really have a big impact on that. And then the birds harvest them in the fall, sometime between late August, probably mid-October, depending on the elevation. And there are still so many questions we have surrounding cone production. We know that cones are wind pollinated in the spring, the second spring. Pinyon pine trees have both male and female cones on the same tree. But what causes that production is very dependent on factors, abiotic factors, like I said, a lot of weather. Genetics probably plays a big part in it. And then also the tree health and maturity. Like I said, trees that are around 100 years old tend to have really great cone production when they're producing, when they have the ability to produce a lot of cones. That age group is when they tend to be very productive. A lot of the sites that we have in Nevada and in some of the other areas in the Southwest, a lot of these trees were removed less than 100 years ago or right around 100 years ago. So a lot of our trees are only, 60, 75, 80 years. So a lot of the younger trees are not producing cones, or at least not producing them in the abundances that pinyon jays really require to subsist for the next year. And then there are so many things that we don't know, like what role does elevation play? What does precipitation, slope, aspect, things like that? We have a lot of ideas, like I said, cool wet areas, but there are so many microclimates out there that provide these conditions that it would be great to be able to nail that down so we can tell land managers, hey, if you have to clear this area, maybe leave, this pocket of trees on this northern slope because we think that they're particularly important for pinyon jay sustenance. And finally, I keep mentioning mast years and how these cones or pinyon pines are a masting species. And what that means is that they tend to produce a lot of cones all at the same time, so synchronously, every couple years. It is a survival adaptation that the trees have come up with. You can think of, the cicadas that people talk about all the time, where suddenly there's an eruption of so many cicadas and they overwhelm, their predators, so that at least a couple can survive and produce to the next year. So it's the same thing with pinyon pines. If they're producing this abundance of seeds, at least some of them will survive until the next year. Pinyon jays are really, really good at retrieving their caches. Lab tests have shown 90 to 95% of their caches get retrieved. But if they're if they're caching 4.5 million cones, if one flock is in a given year, or a million nuts, that 5% is still going to be a hefty chunk of pinyon pines that can produce till the next year. Masts tend to happen every 3 to 7 years, or roughly 3 masts in a 10-year period, at least historically, but there have been signs that these mast years are decreasing in numbers. So instead of a mast every 5 years, there might be one every 7 or 8, and that is likely due to climate conditions. So there has been a link in decreased mast production linked to higher temperatures, drier conditions, which is not particularly surprising, but the data is there to support it. In 2024, we had a mast year. That was exciting, but that was the first mast year documented, I think, since 2019. Oh, yes, according to this graph, since 2019. And again, they happen in cool, wet periods. So that primordial, that initiation period when the cone first becomes established, 2.5 years before it's mature, that's when that year is typically what causes a mast year. Now, there are a lot of other factors that may go into that, such as resource availability in general. And then there has also been some hypotheses that trees in the off years, some of them try to produce while other trees in that same stand produce in another year, just so that there's variability in that resource use. But mast years are when almost all the trees are producing, and producing a lot at the same time. This year, we're looking good for a mast year, depending on how the summer goes. Not as good as last year. And I recently was hearing that that's not an uncommon pattern. A lot of times after a mast year, there's another mast year that's probably not as productive as the first year. Yes, so mast years are very important to pinyon pines, obviously, to reestablish, and also pinyon jays. It can help replenish, some of the population that has been lost. Like I said, there are these boom and bust fluctuations in cone productivity and also pinyon jay populations. After they've got a year of great cone production, they will breed a lot more. There's even thoughts that they may breed in the fall. Just seeing these green cones can have the pinyon jays start to show signs of breeding. Testes enlarge, they start showing signs of breeding. We don't have a ton of evidence to support that, but there have definitely been signs that they're ready to be breeding. Just seeing those green cones really gets them excited. So even though they're dependent on mast years, there's still a lot of time between mast years where they're very dependent on pine nuts. Pine nuts tend to degrade in the soil within a year, so they need an annual supply of pine nuts to be able to survive. They have shown in Arizona, where they've done a lot of studies, that pinyon jay populations do decline when there are large gaps in time with these mast years. And if there are not multiple mast years, those populations remain low. And that might be a lot of what we're seeing with the population trends over time. We know some of those population trends along the margins are even more intense than some of the other areas. We also know that pinyon pine trees are in decline, a lot of those areas. So the southern portion of the pinyon pine range, a lot of those trees are under a lot of drought stress with climate change, and are rarely masting. And so that might be also why we see pinyon jays like on the margins of that habitat using habitat that we're not usually anticipating them using, spending more time in ponderosa pine, in pure juniper forests. We don't have the data yet to show, what those flocks are like or how productive they are, but it might show that they're just not doing as well because their source of pine nuts isn't doing very well. Okay, now I'm going to shift to talking about how we can help collect information on cone production and fill in some of these gaps on cone productivity and how that might impact pinyon jays. Last year, we rolled out our community science effort, cone mapping. It was a Survey 123 form. It's available on the hub, just like the Pinyon Jay data form. You can find it under research. It's a separate tab, but here is a QR code right here. There's a QR code that's going right on the website, and this will allow you to download the cone data collection form. We're requesting surveys be done July through October. It depends on when those cones are really visible. Honestly, this time of year, you can go out and if you're looking at just a 25-meter radius plot, which is what we're asking you to do, you can tell pretty easily if a tree is going to have mature cones. The later you get, the better the odds are that that cone is not going to abort. Because July, a lot of cones do abort in July, and I'll go over what aborted cones look like. There are three main questions that we're asking to characterize pinyon productivity for each crop or for each plot, and that's really based on what cones are mature this season. And again, it's really important to get an idea of where these productive stands are, and then we can layer that information with where Pinyon Jay flocks are. So for the first question, it's how many cone producing pinyon pines are in your plot? Like I mentioned, it's a 25-meter radius plot. So if you've got your survey 123 form and you start a survey, you're going to think 25 meters in any direction that you are. And sometimes it's hard to measure 25 meters. We're hopefully going to get like a field trip scheduled in the next month or two so that we can actually go out in the field and get an idea of 25 meters. I know some people have that distance already in their head, but 25 meters is the radius, and you're going to count how many pinyon pines are within that radius that are old enough to bear cones. So we're ignoring all trees of other species. We're ignoring ones that are too young to be considered mature. And again, it's really hard to tell if a tree is old enough to produce cones, but we'll use that 6-foot rule just as a stand-in. So we're not expecting everyone to go out and measure the base of a tree trunk, especially 25 meters. As many of you know, in Nevada, 25 meters up a hill can be very challenging. So if you see a tree that's less than 6 feet high and it has cones on it, that is still a cone-producing pinyon pine. However, if there's no indication that that tree is producing and there are no cones on it, you can ignore it for these purposes. So in this image, there are a total of 6 trees. We're ignoring one of them because it's not a species, 3 more of them because they're not old enough. So we're going to say that there are 2 trees, 2 pinyon pines that are capable of producing pinyon pine cones. If you're in a particularly dense stand, you can always do an estimate, look behind you and count as long as you're getting, a rough estimate of how many pinyon pines are in there. The second question is what proportion of them have mature cones? So of the trees that are able to produce cones, how many of them do? So again, we're ignoring trees that, you're not counting trees that are too young, you're not counting trees that are of different species, but it's a proportion of ones that have mature cones this year. So a lot of times, if it's a master, you're going to go out and that proportion is probably going to be 100. Every tree that could produce cones is producing cones in some capacity. And it just needs to have one green cone to be able to say, yes, this tree has cones. But in non-mast years, you might go out and there might only be two trees that have mature cones, as is depicted in this image. So the bright green cones is what we're asking about. And the third question is how many of these mature cones are available on average per tree? So this is an idea of production. I mentioned that a lot of times the younger trees, like trees that are capable of producing but haven't hit that like 100-year mark yet, they produce, but it's not a ton of cones. It might only be 20 to 30 cones in a tree. And honestly, if you're a flock of pinyon jays and you're flying over a bunch of pinyon pines, each with like 20 to 30 cones, unless you're desperate, you're probably not going to stop and spend a lot of time foraging there. You're flying around looking for those trees or those tree stands where the trees all have, 200, 400 cones on them. And if anyone did surveys last year, they saw there were a lot of cones out there like that, especially the older cones. So we count the cones on one side of the trees using the flock method, just like you would count for birds, estimating in groups of 10, 20, whatever your preferred bin size is. And then you double it to account for the cones on the other side. After you've been doing this for a while, you're able to just look at a tree and a couple trees and put them in different bin categories. So we're looking at these different descriptions for how many cones are on the trees in your stand. So failed production, most of the trees have less than 25 cones. Poor production means they have 26 to 50. Moderate production is going to be 50 to 200. Good production is 200 to 400. And then it's a bumper crop if it's greater than 400 cones on most of the trees. If you are in a plot and there's, you don't need to spend a lot of time just like, or calculating an average of, oh, well, 7 of the trees in my plot have over 100, and then there's one tree that has none. Just ignore that one tree. It's just a qualitative way to measure, what the productivity in that plot is. And 25-meter radius plots is pretty small, so in theory, most of the trees will be somewhat similar. We have a couple forest health questions just to help inform, why certain tree stands might not be doing well. Again, a lot of that is probably going to have to factor into things like the slope of the area, how wet that area is, whatever the elevation is. Maybe some abiotic factors like soil type are really going into it. But then there's also things like disease and die-off. So we have a couple extra questions just to help inform that. One of the first ones is there evidence of past production? So if there is old cones on the trees, if you'll recall in our earlier questions when we're asking about mature cones, we're completely ignoring old cones. But it can be interesting to note if there are old cones in the area or if it looks like these trees were productive in a past year. Just to say maybe that is abiotic factors, maybe it's just weather this year that they're not very productive, but in past years they were. So it might not be the quality of the soil or what's going on around it, but it could have just been a very hot year for whatever reason. So old cones on the trees or a bunch of old cones on the ground, that states that the stand is productive even if it isn't right now. Another one is there evidence of tree stress? We consider trees to be stressed if more than 30% of the crown has died off. So it's yellowing like this tree is in this picture. This has far more than 30% crown die off, but a lot of times you'll just see a bunch of yellowing in the leaves. And that can indicate a lot of things, including drought, but it can also be an insect infestation or mistletoe infestation. And those things can play into cone productivity. And we want to rule that out and say, this is likely the poor production is likely due to one of these factors rather than, the general landscape. So overall, each of these plots typically takes less than 5 minutes. I mean, it takes a little bit more time when you're first starting to get used to it and calibrate your estimates. But once you've done it, it's really easy to just knock them out. You can do these every 50 meters if you want to, because then the spacing, you're not overlapping. Or you can do it, you can do it when you see a productive pine tree and decide to do it just then, because all that information is valuable. It's great to get information on where stands are not productive. It's also great to get information on where they are productive. And it's very good to get information on what the conditions are like around Pinyon Jay populations. So again, in general, it takes less than 5 minutes. It's important not to get hung up on the numbers. We are asking people to potentially assess up to 5 counts or 5 plots during a Pinyon Jay survey. So if you're out doing, you're walking a mile for your Pinyon Jay survey, it's a good time to stop and just take a minute, do a plot, record some data, and that's, you're doing that anyway when you're stopping and looking for Pinyon Jays. So it shouldn't be too hard. We're working on some fun incentives for people to record more of these plots. So if you do a certain number of plots, you'll get a special prize, a special pine cone prize. It'll be fun. And it does tend to be fun, and it's going to be really informative, I think, in the long run. There is a section for comments, and of course you can add pictures, which is really great. Here are some stages of cone development just to help aid in cone identification. So this first picture on the top left, those are male cones. So that's what you're going to see the spring, 2 springs prior to a mature cone. I mean, you often see these every year, but yeah, they'll come out in the spring. Those are the males. And then the cone or the picture immediately to the right of that, that's your mature green cone. So you see it is a really bright green. I found that edgeless down in the desert Southwest, some of them, they're not quite as green, like they can be a little bit more brownish. They're a little more tight. They're smaller cones in general. But in the Great Basin, we have a lot of these bright green cones. And one of the key ways to see them from a distance is they start to get really resinous. So they sparkle in the sun. And you can see they just look kind of wet and green and bright. And you can tell that they're obviously mature. On the bottom left picture, those are either conelets or aborted cones. These happen to be conelets, but aborted cones look exactly the same. So this picture was taken in March down in Arizona of cones that were to be ripe that following spring or that following summer. And they're, a centimeter or 2 in diameter. They're small, they're brown. If you're seeing cones like this in late July, August, September, those cones have been aborted. They're not the cones for the following year. When it's that late, they just gave up on production. And then if you're seeing really dark brown cones, those are cones from a previous season. Again, that can indicate past production. So thus far, we have collected a fair amount of data using this protocol in this form. So thanks to everyone for doing that. This is 2022 to 2024. We did have a couple pilot studies down in the Southwest in 2022 and 2023. And that's probably why our productivity results are this way. You can see most of that pie shows most of the trees that we saw had failed production. 2022 and 2023, like I said, we didn't find a single mature green cone when we were out doing standard surveys, spending all day looking for ripe cones. So a lot of those were documented from them. We did have a couple records of bumper crops. That's great. A lot of moderate production, which is what we saw a lot around here of moderate production, a lot around Reno. So we're hoping to boost these numbers for next year. Here's some photos that people uploaded while doing the surveys that were really helpful. You can see in this picture, even at a bit of a distance, you can see this tree in the back that is an older, mature tree, very asymmetrical. It is tall, but it's more how asymmetrical it is, that it's an older tree. And even from here, you can see how many cones are on it. The top part of that tree, which is where most of the cones, the mature cones do form, is just loaded with cones. The tree right in front of it, there are a couple cones if you zoom in, but you're not seeing many. That tree is probably only like 25, 30 years, I would estimate without actually knowing. If you were to do this plot, you could also say there is tree mortality. You can see there are 2 trees that are dead right in the background, which is also good information. Here's another tree that's just loaded with cones. I mean, you could barely get to the needles in there without hitting cones. So if a Pinyon Jay flock were flying over and they saw this tree and other trees like it, they would probably stop, and it's probably going to be a foraging location. And we do think that Pinyon Jays probably have these stands that they know are reliable year after year, and they continually visit those stands. And after they've harvested all those seeds, they might range even farther. We know that each year, Pinyon Jay's home range fluctuates based on this cone availability. And years that there are no productive cones, they expand their home range because they're searching for, pine cones or food in any way they can. But they have these set places that they visit year after year where they expect to have productive pine cones. In 2024, we had Pinyon Jay crews out surveying for cone productivity. The red map illustrates all the places in Nevada where we did do cone mapping in 2024. That information is going to be analyzed soon. We got a lot of really good information on large areas. But again, last year was a mast year, so a lot of trees were producing. It'll be really fascinating to go back to these places in 2025 and 2026 and see what the comparison of cone productivity is. So you can see in the Reno area, we did a lot of cone mapping just south of Reno. We did a lot, of course, in the pine nuts. And we're hoping to get back. I mean, we're going to go out there just ourselves and do some cone mapping, maybe do some community science days out there. We have a lot of sites out east, but it'll just be really good to keep up with this information to see how cone productivity changes from year to year. Because like I said, there's not a lot of information. The information we have is on very specific places. A lot of times it's really from Pinus edulis. So it's going to be important to get more information on this in coming years, and especially, to help inform Pinyon Jay conservation in the future. I'm going to finish up with just a couple slides showing different stages of cone productivity, just to get a search image in your head. This is an image of pretty close to mature cones, but very green, so you can tell that they are going to be mature. This was from May 2024. That was in Hidden Valley. So, pretty early in the year. Last year we had a lot of cones producing earlier than we expected. And it could have just been that it was a mild year, and it does fluctuate. When we originally started looking into this, we were told to do cone mapping, that the cones become mature in September and October. Last year, we really learned a lot because this was by July. A lot of cones at lower elevations were mature. This is a mature cone that looks like it's actually aborting. You can see that it's brown towards the bottom, and it's not opening up. A lot of times, once they're green, they'll start getting, like I said, very resinous, and then they'll start to open up. This one is turning brown. It's dying off before it's actually maturing. So it's likely that the seeds inside are not going to be mature enough to provide any sort of substantive nutrition to Pinyon Jays or many other species. Here's some more mature cones. There's a little bit of a glare on this image, but you can see the resin dripping off of those cones. And that's really a sign that those cones are ready to be foraged by pinyon jays, and specifically pinyon jays, because other jays would not be able to get into those cones. That gunk would get stuck in the feathers around their bill, and they'd give up. Or their bill's just not long enough in general for a lot of species. So these are cones that pinyon jays would probably go after, and they'd be the first ones to be able to get into them. Here's an image of another tree with mature cones. You can see this tree, again, it's starting to get that asymmetrical pattern of an older mature tree, which is great for cone productivity. Cone productivity peaks after a couple hundred years, around 400 to 600 years, depending on conditions. Productivity will go down a little bit, but I mean, it's hundreds of years that these trees are very productive. And like I said, a lot of the trees we have in our area, a lot of the trees that we consider or have been considered like encroachment in areas, they're just coming back after, a lot of these trees were clear cut about 100 years ago. Here's another image. This shows some old cones. And I don't know how well you guys can see, but there are also some little tiny cones that are developing for the upcoming year. So this picture was taken probably in March prior to those cones being mature. And this is another picture you can even tell multiple years. So this tree had multiple years of cones on them. The really dark brown ones were from at least 2 years prior. These light brown cones had cones from one season prior. And then you can see the immature conelets growing on the very tips of the pinyon tree, which will become mature the following fall. Okay, that is it. This is the QR code again to download the Survey 123 form. If there are any questions, I can answer them now. Thank you.
Cool. Thanks, Kelly. That was awesome. I don't see any questions yet, but Diane, who is in attendance, just messaged me that the chat was disabled the whole time, which never used to be an option, and now I always forget to enable it. So I did enable it, and now we have a question from Diane. Any news on the Gardnerville Jays near the fire? Yes, from the field trip that we had to cancel because the site was burning down.
Yes. The fire did not reach that area. It was mostly contained to the old burn area. As far as I know, none of us have been down to check on them. That colony, or at least the fire didn't reach the colony site. It may have burned a little bit of the habitat that the pinyon jays use, but I think the colony site was protected. And I imagine those birds are doing just fine.
Yeah, well, and we did find that old nest that was out in the old burn, last year, whenever that was.
Yeah.
Before this new burn, it was burned previously. And it was a nest out there.
Yeah, it was near the old burn, but it was like a little patch of still alive.
Oh,
And
it
I
was.
don't think they were, yeah, I don't think they were nesting there this year. At least we didn't have any evidence of them nesting in that area. They were confined to mostly north of Pine Nut Road. So hopefully they'll be good, and hopefully we'll get out there and be able to check on those old nests and see if we can document a couple new ones.
Yeah, we'll have to get to scheduling that, and hopefully we can get out there this fall with the.
Yeah, that was unfortunate about that fire that morning.
Yes, it was. Yep. Yeah, well, we'll give people another couple minutes for any more questions, but otherwise, suppose that might be it.
Great.
Yeah, well, I don't see anything else coming in, so unless anyone has anything, I will sign us off for the evening.
Sounds good. Thanks, Ned.
Yeah, thank you, Kelly. That was great. Have a good night,
Bye.
everyone.
You
Bye-bye.
too.